Alright, this video was delayed in large part because I got a pretty severe second or third degree burn while filming by my hand slipping and grabbing onto a 500-degree pan. This gave me a kind of, I guess, like Pavlovian aversion to editing this project, which I realize is a pretty lame excuse, but it is the one I've got. Regardless, I developed this recipe as a simple, straightforward, beginner-friendly sourdough that required no specialized equipment whatsoever, not even a razor blade for scoring. What you will still need is a sourdough starter. There are a million guides out there on how to get one going. I could certainly make a guide myself if y'all want, but one way or another, you need one. The first step to this recipe is feeding your starter to make sure it's frenzied and active before you add it to your dough. If your house is colder or if your starter is just less active than mine, this will probably be best to do the night before you want to bake. My house is warm and my starter is extremely active, so I'll do it the morning of because it'll only take my starter 3 or 4 hours to peak after I feed it. For one loaf, you need 40 grams of active starter, so certainly feel free to feed yours less than I am mine here. I'm just making more things. I'm adding 60 grams of water to my starter, mixing that in, and then adding 60 grams of flour, and then mixing that in as well. You want to make sure that every bit of flour is incorporated in, no dry spots. And then just loosely cover that with the lid and set it aside. Do not screw your lid all the way on, it will explode if you do. Next, we're going to make an autolyse. This is basically the dough that we will mix our active starter into. We want to give our flour time to hydrate before we work in our starter for several reasons, not the least of which being that it makes the dough much easier to work with. You can make this anywhere from 30 minutes to a few hours ahead of time. I'm making mine immediately after feeding my starter, but if you're doing your last feeding the night before, just make your autolyse first thing when you get up and let it sit for an hour or so on the counter. This is 240 grams of water, 8 to 12 grams of salt, and 400 grams of flour. This is a 60% hydration dough. I see so many sourdough how-tos that instruct presumable beginners to work with 80 to 85% hydration doughs, and that's honestly just objectively bad advice. Working with very high hydration doughs, even ones made with commercial yeast, is a learned skill all on its own, much less high hydration sourdoughs, which are even trickier to work with. Certainly these high hydration doughs result in a beautiful lacy crumb and great Instagram potential, but a beginner is going to make so many absolutely garbage 85% hydration loaves before they make a successful one that it may dissuade them from sourdough altogether. Start with low hydration, and when you get successful at that, up your hydration level 5% at a time, learning the intricacies of each dough before you advance. I'll get off my soapbox here as we just mix that together into a cohesive dough. If you're going to be autolysing for a shorter period, such as less than an hour, don't mix the salt in, just mix the flour in the water and sprinkle the salt on top afterwards. Another key reasoning behind the autolyse process is that the water activates enzymes present in the flour, which break down some of the starches and proteins in the dough, yielding both a better texture and a better flavor. Salt slows down this process, but it won't stop it. So if salt is in the dough, autolysing for 3 to 4 hours like I'm about to is just fine. But unsalted doughs need shorter autolyses, and shorter autolyses need unsalted doughs, if that makes sense. Anyway, once no dry spots remain, cover your bowl and come back later. 3 hours and some change later, you can see my starter has actually pushed its lid open and is overflowing. So I feel like it probably is ready. We lost some footage here. I've actually already done this next step, which is working the starter in. As you can see by how my starter is no longer literally erupting from its jar and my dough is nice and smooth. I'll do it again for the camera, but due to the fact that this is working in twice as much sourdough starter as the recipe calls for, it does impact the final result. No major problem though. We're going to use 40 grams of sourdough starter. That's 10% by baker's percentage, and I guess it's a good thing that I made some extra earlier. Then, with a wet hand, you are going to spread the starter over the top of the dough, and then with stiff fingers, like you're making focaccia, press the starter firmly down into the dough, pressing all the way through to the bottom of the bowl. And then once your dough is pretty thoroughly dimpled, we're going to do some stretch and folds to layer the starter in kind of laminated in with the dough. If this is the first you're hearing of the term stretch and fold, pretty much what it means is we're going to grasp the edge of the dough, stretch it up at least 2 or 3 times its original length, fold it over, and kind of turn and repeat in all 4 cardinal directions. If your dough starts sticking to your hands, just wet them again with cold water. Do not try to use flour to make your hands non-stick. Then I just bring the dough into this little jellyfish shape, going around and tucking under with each turn. This also helps with layering in the starter. And then we return it to the bowl and just let it rest for 30 to 45 minutes. Once your dough has rested, we're going to develop some gluten. You can do this by kneading, but I prefer doing stretch and folds to develop the gluten. It works exactly the same way as before. With wet hands, grab an edge, stretch it 2 to 3 times its original length, fold it over, and do that on each cardinal direction every 90 degrees. If, once you've made it all the way around, your dough is still feeling slack and stretchy, you can go around again until it feels very firm and, I guess the way to put it is, tightly wound. Then we're going to make the same jellyfish shape as before. My dough is a little more slack here than yours should be due to having twice as much liquid starter added to it at the beginning. But regardless, I'm going to repeat this process every 30 to 45 minutes until I've done it 5 times, with this one being number 1. A lot like this, except slower and 4 more times. I'd show you each time, but I don't have a whole lot to say about this process, so it would be a lot of dead audio space. A couple of hours have passed since I added in my starter, and I can tell my dough has a puffier texture than it did at the start, so it's time for the pre-shaping stage. If you decided to knead your dough instead of stretch and fold, you would simply knead it until it passed the window pane test, and then just let it rest in the bowl for a couple of hours until it was slightly puffy. Go ahead and flour a clean work surface, and then turn your dough out onto it. Do not pull your dough out of the bowl. We're going to be very gentle with our dough from this point out. Unlike breads made with commercial yeast, we do not want to knock any air out of our dough, so let gravity do as much of the work as possible to get it out onto your countertop. If your dough is very stuck, oftentimes just taking one finger and kind of lifting a corner of the dough off of the bottom of the bowl will be enough to unstick it without manhandling the whole batch. Then we're going to use a bench scraper to kind of shove flour underneath the dough, creating a totally non-stick underbelly, making sure we get underneath every corner, every edge, and making sure that none of them are sticking down whatsoever. Then, again with gentle hands, we're going to stretch and fold all around. This time, instead of doing just 4 directions, we're going to do about 8. I don't count them or anything. I just make several folds all around the edge, turning the dough a little each time. Make sure to use a hand to kind of hold down the center point to keep all the folds from unfolding. And then once we've got all those done, we will gently flip it seam side down. Again, we will shovel some flour underneath to ensure that it won't stick, and then we will leave it uncovered on the work surface for about 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, use your bench scraper to make sure nothing is stuck, and then I'm just going to sort of scoot this out of the way. I'm going to grab an ordinary cereal bowl that's big enough to hold all of my dough. You can certainly use a small mixing bowl, or if you have a small round basket that's the right size, that is even better. Whatever vessel you choose, line it with a clean tea towel or linen towel, and then we're going to pretty liberally dust it with whole wheat flour or cornmeal. Try to get all of the nooks and crannies without tilting the bowl too far, otherwise all the flour will slide to one side of the bowl. Back to the dough, we'll flip that back over, seam side up again. Preferably make sure you have your work surface dusted and ready so that you aren't floundering for your flour while awkwardly cradling a ball of dough. And then, exactly like the pre-shaping stage, we are going to do several stretch and folds all around the edge. Your dough's surface is entirely non-stick at this point, so make sure you keep a hold of that center point where all the folds cross over. If you accidentally let go of that, it will entirely unfold. No big shakes though. If that happens, just redo all the folds. Don't try and seal the folds down. We do actually want them to be sort of like fault lines during the baking process. It's totally fine and desirable that they don't stick down right now. Use your bench scraper to help pick the dough up, and then we're going to put it in our bowl seam side up, smooth side down. Cover with the towel and kind of use the towel's weight to help keep the seams closed. We're going to let this proof for 2 to 4 hours depending on how warm or cool your house is and how active your starter is. 2 hours later, here's my layout. We have a sheet pan that will sprinkle with more whole wheat flour or cornmeal. The oven is preheated to 500 and offset to one side in there on the bottom rack. I have a cast iron skillet also preheating to 500. Go ahead and transfer your dough onto your sheet pan, seam side up. As this bakes, those seams will serve as fault lines, so there's no need to score the bread and thus no need for a lame or a grignette. And lastly, get your deepest roasting pan and place it over your loaf on the sheet pan so that there's overhang on whichever side your cast iron pan is on in the oven, and the rims of the pans are flush on the other side. Here's the interior shot of the oven. When the bottom rack is pushed in, the cast iron pan is situated directly underneath the opening into the sort of hot box that we've formed around this loaf. We're going to toss a few ice cubes into the pan so that they immediately begin putting off steam, and slide that back into the place so that the steam drifts up and fills the hot box around the bread. We bake it this way for 30 minutes and then drop the heat to 425, remove the cast iron in the roasting pan, and cook for another 20 or 30 until the exterior is beautifully brown. And here is our finished and cooled loaf. As you can see, it has this sort of strange mesa-shaped flat top. It actually rose up so much that it was pressing into the bottom of my roasting pan. I used to have a much deeper disposable, like tinfoil turkey roasting pan from Walmart, like the kind you take to potlucks and family dinners, but I tossed it when I moved a couple of months ago and I haven't picked up another one. Anyway, let's see that interior. This loaf has a great rustic, chewy crumb. You can see on the half of the loaf in the background that the top of the loaf has some extremely large bubbles. That's what overfermentation looks like in sourdough. That's from having to add the starter to the loaf twice to get the footage. Yours won't have that because you won't do that. Anyhow, that's this recipe. I'll toss a little extra info in the description. Make sure to sub if you haven't already, and drop any requests for recipes in the comments.